I wanted to get started and introduce Seth Hetna, who has written a wonderful book called Trump-Russia, A Definitive History, which looks at a lot of the organized crime, money laundering into the U.S., which is part of some of the cases that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. For example, we're going to have a discussion by one of our speakers on the Prevezon case, which is a case of money laundering. And Seth has done voluminous research of connecting the relationship between some of these processes of illicit financial flows to our present political situation, and has put it in an intellectual context that I think is gripping and well-researched and written. So I asked him to come, and I'll turn the floor over to him for a discussion so he can present his book, which he can also autograph for you outside, and open the floor to questions after he finishes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Louise, for that introduction. So as Louise told you, I'm here at her invitation to give you a perspective on Donald Trump and Russia that, well, some of you have certainly heard it before, but not all of you have. And you know, what we've been hearing mostly about has been Russia's interference in the election, and we hear incessantly, almost hourly, maybe by the minute, about Robert Mueller's investigation. And that's been the focus of our media cover, but you know, we know comparatively little about Donald Trump and his relationship with Russia before the 2016 election. We know he was in Russia. Most people know for the Miss Universe pageant in 2013, and we know he stayed at the Ritz there, and we know the tawdry allegations that happened there. But what happened before? You know, what happened before that? How far back does this go? And those are the questions that motivated my book. And it turns out that it goes way back. It turns out that Donald Trump, our president, has ties to Russian criminal money that go way back. He's been chasing this kind of money for decades. It's been chasing him as well. And it begins in the 1980s. And while this aspect of Trump's career as it relates to Russia hasn't gotten much attention, I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about it. Adam Schiff, the incoming chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, has stated that this is going to be a subject of investigation, what was going on in Russian investments in Trump's properties before the election, and he doesn't want to interfere with Mueller, so that's where he's going to be focusing. And I suspect other committees are going to be doing the same thing. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I spent many years at the Associated Press. I left to write for books, and I write for freelance for New York Times and other publications, Rolling Stone, New Yorker, et cetera. But something I wanted to just get across, I'm based in California, so I'm not part of the Washington herd here of people chasing Bob Mueller around and reporting what he had for breakfast or what he's doing next. And my inclination is when I see a herd, I run the other way. And this book really started as my own exploration to try to understand how Donald Trump, a man who I knew from growing up in New York, how he could be connected to Russia. It just seemed like such an incongruous relationship, but as I explored it, it starts to make more sense. You know, I don't have super secret sources. My source are books. There's an enormous amount of information in the public record, and some people have, you know, made great sacrifices and put that information on the record at risk to their lives, and or worked very hard to get that information out there. And I just thought it behooved us to just take a look at what was existing in the public record and follow up from there. And I also, you know, my book is not, it's not littered with anonymous sources. I spoke to a lot of FBI, a lot of prosecutors who had worked on some of these cases I'm going to be talking about. And this is one of those fortuitous moments as a journalist when you find people who are waiting for the phone to ring because they have a story to tell. And, these were people who had come across Trump early in their career. They'd missed some of these connections. They were focusing on the other end, on the Russian side. And it was only in retrospect they see the bigger picture now. So, I just took the time to read all this information and look through it all, and that's what I did. So let's begin in the 1980s. Trump Tower was a huge success. I remember visiting that as a young boy and being impressed. My mother was even more impressed, and she would probably be a Trump fan if she were alive today. But it was a very unusual building for several reasons. One thing made Trump Tower unusual was its construction. Most New York skyscrapers are made out of steel and glass. Trump Tower was made out of fast-drying concrete, so that gives you an advantage. It means you can build it more quickly, but there was a price to be paid, and that price was that the concrete that forms the skeleton of Trump Tower was poured by a company that had been infiltrated by the Genovese crime family, which is the most powerful of New York's 5 mafia families. And interestingly, these mob leaders would later be indicted by a brash U.S. attorney named Rudy Giuliani, who, in his indictment of these leaders, specifically named price fixing at the Trump Plaza Casino. The second thing that made Trump Tower unusual was that it was only the second building in Manhattan to allow shell companies to buy apartments there. So this was effectively an invitation for all sorts of people who had assets they wanted to conceal. And that's how Trump came to sell 5 apartments for nearly $6 million to a newly arrived immigrant named David Bogatin. What's interesting about my book is, it turns out that I was basically writing a history of Russian organized crime without even realizing it. And this is kind of the early footprints of Russian organized crime on our soil. David Bogatin was part of a wave of Jewish immigrants who had landed on the shores of Brighton Beach, Brooklyn in the 1970s. And these were Jewish emigres who were allowed to leave Russia because of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and that was back when human rights was more of a concern. And we pushed to allow these Jews to emigrate from Russia, and many of them arrived here. And the vast majority, don't get me wrong, the vast majority of these people were hardworking, law-abiding citizens, and they're very grateful for the chance to be in our capitalist system. However, there was speculation in the U.S. intelligence community that the Kremlin began emptying its prisons in 1975, as sort of a pre-Mariel boat lift, in order to rid the country of criminals, including many who still had ties to the black market back home. And the FBI estimates I found showed that about of the 200,000 Soviet immigrants who came to the U.S. in the 70s and 80s, roughly 2,000, so 1%, it's not a huge number, had served time in Soviet prisons, and including Mr. Bogatin here. And as one FBI agent told me, they sent over all their shit. So Russian organized criminals are very different from the other organized criminal groups in the United States that organize themselves around ethnicity. Usually criminals who arrive in America, they don't know their surroundings, so they prey on members of their community, their own ethnic group, before they venture out of their neighborhoods when they get more comfortable. That's not what the Russian criminals did. The Russian criminals, the FBI found the Russian criminals ventured out immediately and set up relationships with other organized criminal groups immediately. David Bogatin had arrived in the United States, and right away he had acquired a string of, so this is a guy who barely speaks English. He arrives in the United States, acquires a string of gas stations, and he sets up a complex scam to cheat the state of New York out of millions of dollars in gasoline tax revenue. It's called the daisy chain scam, for some of you, I'm sure, know it. And he did this in partnership with the Colombia Mafia family and a guy named Michael Francesi, who interestingly now has found Jesus since his release from prison and is now in California, where you can attend his ministry. Every time someone pumped a gallon of gas at one of the stations Bogatin and his partners owed, they kept 27 cents. That's the bottom line of the scam. And you own a lot of stations, you sell a lot of gas, you make a lot of money. And the prosecutors I spoke to said this was generating about $1 million a week. So what do you do with this money? Well, most investors chase yield, right? But criminal money seeks something else. It's looking for safety and obscurity. And that's what Trump offered David Bogatin. Interestingly, the information that I found and it was gathered by the FBI, was that it was Trump who found Mr. Bogatin. I'm not exactly sure how, But he found him and convinced him to invest in Trump Tower, and that's what David Bogatin did. He purchased 5 condos, only one of which was in his own name. The rest were in the name of shell companies set up by a lawyer for the Russian mob. And Trump was pleased by this. He attended the closing sale on Bogatin's casino, something he didn't have to do. And this really would be the foundation of Trump's relationship with the Russian, with Russia for years to come. Trump was a man with whom they could do business. So not long after he purchased his Trump Tower condos, Bogatin was indicted for the gas tax scam. New York had noticed there were millions of dollars missing in gas tax revenue all of a sudden. And he pledged his Trump Tower condos as collateral for bail and then fled to Europe. He set up a chain of banks there, and he was finally arrested, not on a red notice, but because someone had tipped off a Warsaw newspaper about his fugitive status. And he wound up, he had formed organized crime connections all over Europe, but he had ticked off the wrong person. And he wound up extradited back to the U.S. to serve time in Attica. And I've recently heard from a former federal agent that he was still dealing with Trump or talking to Trump after his release from prison. So what else is going on around this time is Trump is showing a growing interest in Russia. He made his first trip to the Soviet Union in 1987 with his then wife Ivana. And to me, this is the most interesting. This is a basically ignored chapter of this history. He was invited at the behest of the Soviet government. So here's a man who, as we all know, is a very voluble and brash capitalist. You could call him the very embodiment of American capitalism. And he's being invited on a public tour of a country that has abolished private wealth. A place where millionaires are still being lampooned as fat cats and top hats. And Trump ostensibly went there to scout real estate deals, and do some sightseeing. But something else was going on, and I think buried in the archives of KGB files somewhere, we may find evidence that he was being carefully studied and maybe groomed for bigger things. Because shortly after his return from Moscow, he hinted he was interested in running for president. And he took out ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post, over there on my right there, criticizing U.S. foreign policy. And the ad reads, you can't read it, but it says, "For years, Japan and other nations have been taking advantage of the United States, and the world's politicians are laughing at us." Sounds familiar, right? So he criticized the U.S. policy of paying for Japan's defense. And what's interesting about this is that I found congressional testimony from a KGB defector who said that dividing the U.S.-Japan alliance was a key KGB objective. So maybe I'm going to be using the word coincidence a lot, but maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. So we're going to move ahead now to the 1990s. There's another criminal name, a bigger name in the Russian criminal underworld, a guy by the name of Vyacheslav Ivankov. He shows up in Trump's world. Ivankov, please forgive my Russian. I apologize in advance. He was a voruj zakonye, a thief who follows the code. That's a rough translation, and it's a rough equivalent of a mafia godfather. He's kind of like the John Gotti, I guess you could say, being sent over to the United States. And he's a vor, and that's a rank that you can only acquire in prison. But he wasn't just any vor. He was the most highly regarded of them all. His cruelty was legendary. There are all kinds of stories you can find about people being taken into the woods and Quentin Tarantino style, tortured and so on. So he had eventually run afoul of Soviet law enforcement, and he wound up in prison after a KGB sting and sentenced to 14 years in prison. But as we've heard, Russia not only abuses the U.S. judicial system, it also abuses its own judicial system. Ivankov had many powerful friends, as we'll hear. One of them was a guy named Semyon Mogilevich, who was a fixture of the Russian criminal scene, and he even spent a few years on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. According to the FBI files, Mogilevich bribed a judge on Russia's Supreme Court to secure Ivankov's release. And a year later, he landed at JFK on a visa for film work and quickly disappeared. So the FBI gets wind that Ivankov had arrived in the U.S., and there's a guy, I don't know if any of you know, Jim Moody from the FBI. he had kind of spearheaded a brief and short-lived but very hopeful partnership between Russian law enforcement and the FBI. And an MVD general arrives and tells him that, Ivankov, there's this guy named Ivankov in your country. You might want to go look for him. And Moody had never heard of him. So the FBI starts to look for him, and they find him in traces of him in Trump Tower. And he vanishes again. He shows up next in Trump's casino, his new casino, the Taj Mahal, where he's a high roller, and he's getting complimentary limousine rides back and forth from Brighton Beach, Brooklyn to Atlantic City. And I don't know how many of you actually visited the Taj Mahal. It was a favorite destination for Russian emigres. If you ever went in there, it's actually a really seedy place when I went there, but it was kind of stank of smoke, and you heard a lot of Russian. That was my impression of it. And the Russian mafia also made the Taj Mahal a favorite hangout, due in no small part to the casino's propensity to look the other way at money laundering. From the moment it all opened, the Taj Mahal was a money laundering concern. And casinos, as you probably know, are a perfect place to launder cash. You walk in with a pile of dollars, you turn it into chips, and you have a good accountant who can write them off as legal winnings. So to thwart, the casinos obviously know this, and to thwart this, they are required to file currency reports every time somebody cashes in more than $10,000 for chips, except for the Taj Mahal. They didn't do this, and the Treasury found more than 100 instances in its first year and a half of operation where the CTRs, these currency reports, weren't being filed. So what's going on? Prosecutors tell me they find Russian organized criminals going back and forth with bags of money and cashing them into chips at the Taj Mahal. So just as the case as we saw at Trump Tower in the 1980s, facilitating money laundering is good for business. And when Ivankov gets wind for the FBI was looking for him, he vanishes again. He's eventually captured in Brighton Beach, where FBI's find in a phone book that contains not just working phone and fax numbers for the Trump Organization, but also a number for the Trump Organization's Trump Tower residence. So he's got Donald's number, right? So, so let's step back a second. So Trump is selling apartments in Trump Tower in the 1980s to criminals. He's welcoming them into his casinos in the 1990s. But what's happening in Russia? Well, I'll skip the general talk, but it's disintegrating into what Boris Yeltsin described as a superpower of crime. The world largely ignored Yeltsin's plea, with one notable exception. I'm proud to share this one with you, and I'm going to read you a quote here. The present passivity against the growing power and entrenchment of post-Soviet organized crime may usher in a new form of authoritarianism with very severe long-term consequences for the citizens of the former Soviet Union, and indeed for the rest of the world. So that was written, I don't know the date, Louise, but it was 1994, written by Professor Shelley, who, while everybody is singing Kumbaya about Yeltsin and Clinton in Russia, is seeing what's really going to happen. And that's when I decided to try to contact Professor Shelley. She tells me, I'm too busy to talk to you, go away. So I said, well, this is an interesting quote, well, okay, maybe, so what about this? And so she without talking to me, she answered many important questions that I had for her. So thank you, Professor Shelley. But what she saw, I think, is that when the rule of law is subverted, as it was in Russia, and you could argue, as is happening right here in this country today, democracy withers and dies on the vine. I think that's what she saw. For Trump, however, this is business, and the 1990s were good for business. The flows of Russian criminal money into Trump's organization are about to get a lot bigger. So, whoops, I'm jumping ahead there, sorry. He returned to Russia in 1997 to announce plans to open his company's first overseas development. And this is a tower not located in Canada, not located in London, but yes, you can probably guess by now, in Moscow. To do that, however, he required approval from Moscow's imperious mayor, Yuri Lushkov, a holdover strongman from the Soviet era. And Lushkov kept a tight grip on Moscow, and nothing got built without his say-so. And he and his staff usually demanded their pound of flesh. I'll read a quote from John Barrow, the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Lushkov used criminal money to support his rise to power and has been involved with bribes and deals regarding lucrative construction contracts throughout Moscow. Corruption pervaded Moscow, quote, with Mayor Lushkov at the top of the pyramid. And among Lushkov's friends was the Russian vor we saw earlier, VHS Levov. So during his trip to Russia, Trump meets with a deputy mayor named Vladimir Rezin, a man who would later become infamous for being photographed wearing a watch worth $1 million. I didn't know there were watches that cost $1 million, but apparently there are. And Rezin didn't like Trump's plan for a tower, but he offers him a deal to renovate 2 crumbling Moscow hotels. And I'm bringing this up because I think Trump is learning at this point how business is done in Russia and how communication is, how to finesse and how to send the right signals. And what happens is, back in the United States, while the deal is still pending, Trump meets with a Russian sculptor named Zurab Tsereteli, who's the guy there on my left. And Tsereteli, the sculptor, was in New York trying to find a home for his massive sculpture of Christopher Columbus. I don't know if you ever, some of you might know this. It's the biggest statue in the Western Hemisphere. And Trump was going to help Tsereteli in New York and became a big booster of him for years, talking about how he loved his grandiose creations and he was such a fan. So what's going on here? Is Trump interested in art? Is he interested in Tsereteli the sculptor? Well, I would argue no. Trump is many things, but art connoisseur is not one. But the only art Donald Trump seems to like is paintings of Donald Trump. But what interested Trump about Tsereteli were the sculptor's relationships. And this is why I'm bringing this up. Relationships are everything in Moscow, in Russia. And it's who you know, not what you know, that determines whether you rise or fall. And even in the Russian art world, connections are everything. And even a sculptor can have connections to organized crime. So I just love these. So this is, if you could put organized crime into art form, this is probably what it would look like. This is a giant statue of Putin. This is in New Jersey, I think. This is a teardrop. I don't know if you can see it. And it's a 9/11 memorial. I suppose it's supposed to evoke sadness. And this is the Columbus statue, which you can't really, it's just so massive, you can't really do justice to it. But, so many New York, he was trying to get it in so many cities. Trump was trying to help him get it in New York. Every city said no. And the place where it is now, where it winds up and where it still stands, is Puerto Rico. Was the only place they could find a home for it. So Tsereteli's patron is the reason why Tsereteli is important to Trump is because his patron is Mayor Lushkov. He'd given him all sorts of commissions, and Tsereteli's work are popping up all over Russia, all over Moscow. And this is including a 15-story statue of Peter the Great that's so reviled that someone once tried to blow it up. And Tsereteli also had other connections. And this is the fascinating thing. This is one of the fascinating things for me is that you dig into his past and you find people like Grigory Luchansky, which is a name that if you were in the CIA in the 1990s rang alarm bells. Luchansky's funding his Tsereteli's efforts to get statues placed overseas. And Luchansky is a founder of a company called Nordex GmbH. It's an infamous kind of firm set up in Austria that was originally set up to get Communist Party funds out of the Soviet Union. However, Luchansky branched out into smuggling drugs, weapons, and nuclear technology. And another bizarre chapter in this story is that one of Tsereteli's bronze sculptures came packed in boxes filled with copper in what seems to be a scheme to avoid export taxes. So he's sending boxes of a bronze sculpture, and there are 5 times as many more boxes just filled with copper. And what Trump is really doing here with his incessant praise of Tsereteli the sculptor is signaling to the right people back in Moscow, probably principally Mayor Lushkov, that he was their man. So Russia's the well that Trump keeps going back to. By the 2000s, Trump is putting his name on buildings that are literally being financed by gangsters. And in this picture, you have representatives of I don't know how else to say this, but Central Asian organized crime. This is the group that financed what became Trump Soho in Lower Manhattan, which was proudly featured for you Apprentice fans on the 2nd season of The Apprentice. And today, if you ask Trump about these people, as many lawyers have in many depositions over the years, he'll tell you he barely knew them. So we have here, on this side, Tamir Sapir, who was a Georgian emigre who went from running a Manhattan electronics store, selling boomboxes to Russians, to overnight earning a fortune trading oil in the Soviet Union. And we have, even more interestingly, on there a man named Tevfik Arif, who's a native of Kazakhstan, who made a fortune in the rare metals sector after the fall of the Soviet Union. What's interesting about Arif is that, reporters in Russia, some of whom were targeted for assassination for their work, traced him back to the Soviet criminal underworld in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, which we heard a little bit about earlier. And this was a sort of homeland for organized crime groups, I guess sort of like a Sicily for Central Asian organized crime. And among the, some of you know these names, I'm sure, that there are many local hoodlums who made it big in the organized crime world. Michael Chernoy is one. And Alimjan this is a tough one, Toktakunov, who, I don't think it's a coincidence, but Toktakunov was behind a sports betting ring that was being run out of Trump Tower. And then he shows up at a guest at the Miss Universe pageant in 2013. So all of these people they know each other, and they keep surfacing in connection with Trump and in his world. And it's Tevfik Arif is the man who hires Felix Adler. Most of you probably know about Felix Adler. He's the ex-con who ran a mob-linked Wall Street scam and then spent years as an undercover government informant. Felix Adler, in my view, has kind of unfairly been blamed as some kind of criminal mastermind. I think he's a little more than a distraction, actually. Arif and the men behind him are what's interesting to me. And the men behind him are people known as the Kazakh Trio. This is a guy, Alexander Mashkovitz, who's a Kazakh-Israeli billionaire, and his partners. And these members, the Kazakh Trio, wound up being busted on a luxury yacht off the coast of Turkey, along with underage call girls who were part of a ring that was being organized by Arif. So, these are the kinds of people that Trump is doing business with here. And then there are other Trump-branded projects. There's a tower in Toronto, which is financed by an Austrian bank with connections to Semyon Mogilevich, the gangster I mentioned earlier. The front man on that project is a guy named Alexander Schneider, whose father-in-law is a notorious organized crime figure, who is also in the same circle as some of these people. And then there are Trump's projects in Florida, which seem to cater to middle-class Russian criminals and others that flock to what's been called Little Moscow. So, you can literally drive yourself crazy with this. You try to find the center here, and you wind up with diagrams and charts and concentric circles, and you get lost trying to figure out who's behind this all. And then your wife looks at you funny, and you realize that you're starting to look like something out of A Beautiful Mind, the kind of troubled mathematician John Nash. In the end, I think the center of the circle is Donald Trump. He himself held himself out as a guy with whom all the people we've been talking about could do business with. And it's quite clear to me that the only way in hell that Donald Trump would be granted a top secret clearance is by getting elected president. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Trump has gone after people who know a great deal about this world of Russian organized crime. And I know I've used that word coincidence a lot, and I'm reminded of a quote from Ian Fleming, a former British naval intelligence officer and the creator of James Bond. The quote is, "Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action." What's really at the heart of this matter is Trump's amorality. As the anonymous senior Trump administration official wrote recently in the New York Times, the root of the problem is president's amorality. You can't say it any more clearly than that. Tune sic semper, right? So it was ever thus. If you have no morals, then you lie as a matter of habit. If you have no fixed principles, you have loyalty to no one but yourself, and you do business with organized criminals. Money is money, right? As long as it's green. And I'm not going to spend any more time analyzing Donald Trump than I have to, because he lives in our heads every day. And at least I can describe some comfort from the fact that Robert Mueller seems to inhabit his head much as Donald Trump inhabits ours. What Trump didn't realize when he graduated from doing business with the Italian mafia to the Russian mafia is that he was dealing with a completely different animal. The Italian mafia stands outside the state. It stands in opposition to the state. The Russian mafia, however, is part of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And I'm not the first to describe Russia as a mafia state. It's quite easy to make the claim, as some have, that Trump was co-opted by the Russian mafia and he became their agent. I don't think that's true. First of all, if Trump is anybody's agent, if he's Putin's agent or anyone, he's the worst agent in history because he basically runs around broadcasting his feelings unfiltered all the time. But I think that if you did business with Trump and you got to know him and he got to know you, you could have some influence with him. You could help shape his thinking or what passes for his thinking. But you don't control him. I don't think anybody controls Trump. But what the history here shows are deepening bonds of trust with people that no sensible businessman would ever get anywhere near. So what happens when Trump runs for president? Well, we don't know yet, right? But we can make some educated guesses here. If you're a Russian with a connection to Trump, and many people have connections to Trump, all of a sudden you have a valuable card to play. And if you get the ear of the Republican presidential nominee, then you really have proved your service to Mother Russia. Maybe you can set up a meeting in Trump Tower with a Russian government emissary. Maybe you had business dealings with Trump's campaign manager. Maybe you met a young Trump foreign policy aide in Italy, a clueless young man who seems naive and gullible. Maybe you have politically connected friends in the NRA. So the Russians keep knocking on the door of the Trump campaign, and the door keeps opening. Why? Because these are familiar faces. Trump couldn't see or didn't care to see that the people reaching out to him had an ulterior motive. These were his friends. Never mind what the intelligence community thinks. In fact, it would be shocking if Trump hadn't tried to use Russia hadn't tried to use its connections to Trump. Russia has been seeking backdoors to the White House since the Kennedy administration. And one fascinating little-known chapter in history is that Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, met every 2 weeks with a Russian named Georgy Bolshakov, who was then the head of the Washington bureau of the TASS news service. A genuine friendship developed between Bolshakov and the Kennedys, and they used Bolshakov to convey messages to the Kremlin and Premier Khrushchev. The problem was that Bolshakov wasn't what he appeared to be. He was in fact a Russian spy, a colonel in the GRU, the Russia's military intelligence service that we've been hearing a lot, has been making its presence very known to us in recent days. And in the run-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bolshakov is assuring the Kennedy brothers, that the Kremlin would never put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Fortunately, the U.S. intelligence had its own source in the GRU. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky was secretly spying for America, and he helped the United States understand that, yes, the Soviet Union was building missile bases a few hundred miles from Miami, and he lost his life providing that information. Now, imagine if Donald Trump had his own Georgy Bolshakov. Unlike Kennedy, Trump appears inclined to distrust his own intelligence community, who he's likened to Nazis and said flat out that he doesn't believe the things they tell him. He's also an avid fan of conspiracy theories, which he peddles regularly to the American people. He appears to be completely ignorant of history. And then there is the very real possibility that Russia holds some sort of leverage over this president. And I believe this leverage is probably financial in nature, not sexual, as many people seem to think. Or it may involve members of Trump's family. And of course, this has direct and serious consequences for U.S. foreign policy that you know better than I. But the way I see this playing out is in U.S. sanctions policy. There appears to be two policies regarding sanctions toward Russia. There's the administration's hardline sanctions, which are basically a carryover from the Obama administration and are in some ways even tougher. You know, when Trump says that he's been tougher on Russia than anybody, he's sort of half right, but he's also half wrong, because there's another policy that seeks to soften the administration's hardline sanctions by repeatedly delaying or undermining their effectiveness. And Exhibit A is Oleg Deripaska, we've heard about already, who was slapped with very tough sanctions in April on personally and on his business. And they roiled the U.S. aluminum market, and they caused serious consternation in Russia. But since then, he's been granted, I lost count, I don't know, what is it, 6, 7 extensions? These things have been delayed for months. So I'm not sure how this works, but there seems to be this softening that goes on behind the scenes. And there are other examples I'm happy to talk about further if you like. So let me boil it down. I believe that Russia did help elect Trump, but I believe the return was a promise that he would do something to lift the pressure of the sanctions regime. We can come up with all kinds of alternative reasons, but Occam's razor here, this is the simplest and most logical explanation. Sanctions are what's driving Putin and his regime insane. It's why they go after Bill Browder. They are beside themselves, because what's the point of stealing a fortune if you can't go and enjoy it by shopping in New York or buying apartments? It's kind of pointless, right? So, I think Trump was there was some sort of agreement that that something was supposed to be done about this. And I've heard, that that in Russia people are very displeased with Trump, let's say. So to sum up here, it's sordid, it's grubby, but this whole story of Trump and Russia, it becomes fantastical in the headlines. It's really just all about money, and that's the bottom line. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have, or not. Okay. Well, enjoy your lunch, everybody. Oh no, there is a question. Yes.
Hey, Kim Dozier with the Daily Beast and former AP. So why hasn't he been prosecuted for any of this?
That's a great question, and I get that a lot. He's Donald Trump is this goes back to his days in the 70s. He was the subject of, I think, 4 grand jury investigations that he escaped prosecution in. Moving through this timeline, I don't think the pattern was clear to people. And I've spoken to several FBI agents who are kind of wistful about this and see what they missed. That they were looking at there was a tremendous concern in the 80s and 90s about the Russian mafia, but it was about the Russian mafia. It wasn't about Trump, and that was the focus. And I think the focus blinded them a little bit. Real estate is the perfect area to be in for money laundering. There's no SEC. There's no Federal Reserve looking over your shoulder. There's no regulator. There's no regulation. You can, I think recently we've had some changes to that. For years, you could just buy and sell real estate, and as long as you signed your correct name on the paper, it was legal. So he was in the right space. To answer your question, that he's good at putting a distance between himself and these kinds of people, and there was sort of a blinders kind of focus for too long on investigators. But it's a good question.
So just to follow up, what is your next book going to be on? Are you going to look at some other aspect of Trump's investments?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have one yet. I'll have to see where things lead. I don't have a book in mind yet, but.
Well, we'd love if you'd look into his investments in the Gulf. That would help me.
Okay. Okay. If you give me some sources, I'll take a look. Anybody else or anything? That's a great question. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you listening to me, and enjoy. Oh, there's another one. Every time I say, I'm done, and there's another question. So I'll just keep saying I'm done.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate the Ukraine connection.
Yeah.
Could you help? Or to ask and answer?
Again, this is the problem with the concentric circles I was talking about earlier. So it helps if you just, if you forget about the organized crime for a second and just think about this as a business and money flows. And that's how I try to look at it. Trump is taking money from wherever he's going to get it. He can't get it from banks, so he's going to go wherever it's coming from. Probably the biggest bang I got out of my book, and I haven't mentioned this at all, but Michael Cohen. I've talked to federal sources, and Michael Cohen is a very interesting connection to all this. His father-in-law is a guy named Fema Schusterman, who is a criminal conviction for a money laundering related offense, and he was also deeply involved in taxi medallions, and he kind of passed along his business to his son. And what my federal sources told me was that Cohen had come into Trump's world as sort of a thank you or a favor to Michael Cohen, and I forgot to mention his father-in-law is from the Ukraine, and so there were sources of money coming into Trump's world from there. There's also Ukraine connections, obviously, to Manafort, but I think I think Manafort, his connections go even deeper into Russia. I think, Ukraine. The way I see it is that Ukraine, at least when Manafort was there, he was partially representing Russia's interests, albeit indirectly. Yanukovych was a very pro-Russia candidate, and Manafort, as we've seen, has numerous entanglements to Russia. So but there's no center to this. There's no, you know what I mean. It's just money, and money coming from anywhere. Trump isn't being ethnic specific or territorial. It's just money to him. So if it comes from Ukraine, great. But if not, he'll find it somewhere else. I don't know if that answers your question, but sort of. Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Or yes?
Is it your understanding that Mueller's going right down this road of your book?
Well, Mueller's mandate is to look at possible collusion in the 2016 election. That said, he's basically a U.S. attorney with his own department, and he's only has to report to the well, I guess now it's the Attorney General. I don't know. My general rule is that whenever somebody says they know what Mueller is doing or thinking, I tend to just cross that person off my list, because I see Robert Mueller as a submarine who surfaces periodically, and we spot him at the far away from the last position he was, and we have no idea how he got there. And so we catch these little tendrils in the press that Jerome Kersey or Roger Stone is saying this or that. It's a sideshow, and I think he is. All right, I'm going to violate my rule here, but what I think he's doing is trying to tell the story of what happened to the 2016 election in indictment form. He's not going on Twitter. He's not issuing press releases, and he's not leaking. But you read the indictments, and they're very deep. They're insanely detailed. I mean, they're almost novelistic, and you can form a very vivid picture of what's happening. I don't think Mueller's going to go down this road as much as the House will in the months to come. I think because they don't want to step on his mandate, right? So I think they're going to be looking at this because it's sort of one step removed from the election. So I think we're going to be hearing more about it. Thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am.
As I understand, I think you make a valid point that for Trump, money and financial gains have been sort of the leading incentive in creating and sustaining these relationships. Many would say, though, that Trump's foreign policy on Russia, even with Deripaska's extensions, has been in some ways stronger and more brass than it has been under Obama's administration. Sale of lethal arms to Ukraine included, for example. So I understand that he's primarily he's guided by the financial benefits on the one hand. On the other hand, he has not sort of sacrificed yet on the policy front vis-a-vis Russia doing the right thing, quote unquote. Where do you think the collision may come, where Trump would withhold or not agree with the policy or not pursue a policy that is necessary at the expense of certain financial gain or otherwise?
I see it in the sanctions. I take your point. It's a confusing picture, right? And it's almost an administration at war with itself a little bit. I mean, but there are other examples of sanctions. So the other one I'll pull out is that Congress has there's two bipartisan bills pending in the Senate right now, and they're very simple. They say that if Russia interferes in the next election, then we will hit them as harder than they've ever been hit. We will sanction their debt. We will kick their banks out of this country, and this is one of the bizarre loopholes in sanctions policy. There's these sectoral sanctions, so you can sanction a bank, and many Russian banks are sanctioned, but all that really does is just restrict them from the capital markets. So Sberbank or VTB can, and they have offices in Manhattan, and they do investment banking, functions and roles, and there's 20% of the shares of Sberbank are held in the United States, which is very odd for a sanctioned bank. So, so this bill would end that. It would kick the banks out of the United States, would end all future debt sales. It would, and that would really punish Russia. When these bills were leaked or their drafts came out, the Russian stock market, took a dive. So these bills are pending in Congress. They're starting to gain momentum. And what happens? Trump issues an executive order declaring elections a matter of national security. Finally, after 600 days in office, he realizes that elections are important. And what he does is just apply a menu of sanctions which are more of the same. So what he's doing, and he's undermining, the purpose of the executive order, in my view, is to undermine the congressional bills, to beat them to the punch, right? And say, look, we've done something about elections. And that's where I see this kind of taking shape. The other thing is his own, it's easy to make too much of it, but his own personal behavior towards Putin. When you go into a room alone with a former KGB colonel who specialized in, bending dissidents and getting them, co-opting them, and trying to get them to bring them to the Soviet point of view, and that was his job. There's so many things wrong with that picture, but Trump is insisting on this, I think, despite the people in his administration who I've no doubt are telling him not to do this. And there's just this weird kind of two-headed monster, and you're right. I mean, there are some things that are stronger, but there are also some things that are much weaker. So it's not the perfect answer, but that's how I see it. Anything else, or shall I wrap it up? All right. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate it, and enjoy your. Oh, right. There are books outside, so.
There are books outside for those of you who've had your interest wet, and Seth can sign them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Louise.